Today we'll be looking at the issue of poverty and wealth. Proverbs gives a number of different views on poverty and wealth. It kind of looks at it from different perspectives. So we'll be looking at a number of different passages from the book of Proverbs and seeing how it gives us a total picture of how we should view wealth, riches, and how God views us and the poor. So the first thing I want to look at is the Proverbs talks about is the issue of hard work. In other words, how hard work helps us in the area of making a living. So, for example, in chapter 10, verses 4 to 5, it says the following: Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. So in this Proverbs, because Proverbs in those days was set in an agricultural background, the idea was if you worked your land diligently, you would be able to create wealth for yourself. Now, this is something that I have a very good understanding of, given that I grew up on a farm. And my earliest memories from about the age of 12 were getting up every morning before school to hand milk cows because we sold milk directly to customers. So I'd get up usually about 6 in the morning, milk my quota of cows with my father, and then I would get my breakfast and go to school. And when school was over, I would come home in the afternoon, arrive home from school, and I would milk my quota of cows again, feed calves, clean out the sheds, and then have my dinner. And basically that was every day of my life till I left for college at 18. So I understand the idea of working the land and taking care of your animals in order to make a living. And we made a good living from it, but I learned the art of a good living came from hard work. In Proverbs chapter 14, verse 4, it says this: Where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes through the strength of the ox. Again, in those days, if a farmer invested in an ox, he would pay money for it, but the oxen's strength meant that he could plough his land much deeper, and as a result, he would get a better crop. And so the oxen in time was a good return on investment. So this is the idea that sometimes in order to make money, you have to invest money in the right way. In chapter 14, verse 23, it says this: In all labor there is profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. Again, it's this idea that simply talking about work is not the same as doing work. You actually have to be engaged in meaningful work in order to make a profit. In chapter 24, verse 27, it says this: Prepare your work outside and make it ready for yourself in the field. Afterwards, then, build your house. Again, let's look at this one again. It says, Prepare your work outside and make it ready for yourself in the field. Afterwards, then, you may build your house. So this is the idea that you first take care of your farm. You take care of the land that's actually producing the wealth. Then you go and take care of your own needs, which is basically building a home. So the land comes first, the work comes first, and then when you've made the money, you can then build a home. In fact, you can then spend the money. In Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 to 34, there's a number of verses here where the writer says he observes what happens in life. And here's what he says: I passed by the field of the sluggard and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. So he's seeing this vineyard and this farm, and the wall's broken down, everything is covered in thistles and nettles, so no work has been done here for a long time. And it continues in verse 32. When I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come like a robber, and your want like an armed man. So he reflects on what he saw, and he realizes that because this person didn't do any labor, he didn't work his vineyard, even though he had a vineyard and he could have made money, he didn't work it. Instead, he preferred to sleep and slumber, stay in his bed, and slowly the weeds took over, the nettles took over, the wall got broken down, and over time, poverty will overcome him. So this is this idea that when there's opportunity to work and to earn your money, you need to take that opportunity. Because if you don't, then in time you will regret it. So we're saying about opportunity. So in our culture, for example, we have the opportunity to get an education. And if you squander that opportunity, then there may be consequences later in life. It may be more difficult to get work and more difficult to make a living. As in this example of the vineyard, you have to take the opportunities when they come and use them. And down in chapter 27, verses 23 to 27, it gives another observation. It says, "Know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds, for riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. When the grass disappears, the new growth is seen, and the herb on the mountains are gathered in. The lambs will be for your clothing, and the goats bring the price of a field. And there will be goat's milk, enough for your food, for the food of your household, and subsistence for your family." So again, in this proverb, he's advising the person, again, it's an agricultural background, he's advising them to take care of the flocks, pay attention to your herds, focus on your business, on what actually makes your living. And he's advising him to, follow the seasons with the crops as they come in, as the grass, one grass withers, new grass comes. He's told to look after his sheep and his lambs because they provide clothing for him and they provide the milk, which he can then make things like goat's cheese from, and he'll have subsistence for his household. So again, it's the idea of where there's opportunity to make a living, you work hard, you take care of it, you keep your eye on it. And it's interesting that he says in verse 24 here, he says, "For riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations." So sometimes in life you can earn a nice bit of money and then you think, oh, I've earned money, I've got savings, I can afford now to slack off, I don't have to work hard anymore, I can live off those savings. But he's warning him the riches don't last forever. Money put by will soon be used up. And you have to understand that savings in themselves are not riches. What's really riches is the means to make money. And so in this case, it's the man who takes care of his farm. If he takes care of it right, he will always have a constant supply of funds. So the takeaway from this section here is, in effect, there's no quick way to riches. Hard work is the best thing to do if you want to get sustainable income over time, is you apply yourself and you work hard and diligently. But the thing is this the only story the Proverbs has to say? Is this the only perspective? And it actually isn't, because it has a couple of other perspectives on it. Because if it were only the idea of hard work is what makes wealth, then that sounds like the American dream. But there is more to wealth and to life than just hard work. This next section in Proverbs looks at the idea that, yes, honest work is really good and it's a means of making a living and wealth, but that means honest work. And so cheating or finding shortcuts that are immoral or wrong are really not what you should be doing. So let's look at some examples of this in Proverbs. In chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just way is his delight." And in chapter 20, verse 10, it says similar. It says, "Differing weights and differing measures, both of them are abominable to the Lord." And this was the idea that if you were selling, for example, produce in the marketplace and somebody came to buy a pound of tomatoes, but you had a different weigh scale you used, and so that weight was not correct, and instead of them getting a pound of tomatoes, they only get 0.8 of a pound of tomatoes. So by using unfair scales, you're cheating them out of money. Now you will make more profit for yourself because you're getting more money per pound, but ultimately God is not happy with that, and he's saying that that is not a right thing to do. Down in chapter 13, verse 11, it says, "Wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it." Again, it's kind of saying a similar thing, that when you cheat people financially, when you do those deals that aren't right, in the short term you may gain wealth, but ultimately it'll dwindle away. You will lose out in the long term. But the one who applies diligent labor, they increase their wealth over time. So it's the idea that diligent labor, when it's honest diligent labor, that's the best labor because it will give you results in the long term. In chapter 15, verse 27, it says this, "He who profits illicitly troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. So again, Proverbs is warning that when you do something illicit, something illegal, you trouble your own house. In other words, it will eventually come back on top of you. Like, for example, some people might decide that they're not going to pay their insurance. And then when something happens to their business, like a fire or a break-in, they suddenly are uncovered. Or they might decide, well, I won't pay the VAT this month. And then eventually it catches up on them. So when you do illicit things, it ultimately comes back on you. So you're warned, don't do that. Instead, hate bribery, hate corruption, and you'll do better for it. In chapter 20, verse 17, it says a similar thing. It says, bread obtained by falsehood is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth will be filled with gravel. So again, it's this idea that maybe there's satisfaction initially when you do falsehood and you cheat somebody and you get that extra money, but ultimately it'll taste like gravel in your mouth, because you won't be able to look at yourself or other people with integrity anymore. You'll be suffering from literally your guilty conscience. And so you're advised, yes, work hard, but also work honestly. Don't take the shortcuts of cheating. Now, in this section, in looking at wealth in Proverbs, we're going to look at the fact that Proverbs is very clear on the fact that lives for the rich and for the poor are not quite the same. That it can be very difficult for a person to live if they live constantly in poverty. And the rich are protected from some things in life. And this section in Proverbs is not saying whether that is right or wrong or whether that is the way that life should be. It's simply pointing out the fact that this is often the way we find life. And it's no harm to be realistic about the life that some people have to live and the way wealth works in a society. So, for example, in chapter 10, verse 15, it says this: the rich man's wealth is his fortress. The ruin of the poor is their poverty. So wealth provides for the rich person a fortress, which is like a very strong building. In comparison to the poor, their building can end up in ruins because of poverty. So, for example, a rich person could suffer some financial setback. Maybe a very big bill comes in that was unexpected. And for the rich person, it's probably an inconvenience. For the poor person, the same thing could result in them having no food on their table. So the consequence of a small setback is very different for the rich as it is for the poor. For example, if we contrast today in the US, the effect of COVID in the US on those people who have medical insurance and those who don't. For example, in the last 10 years in the US, there's been quite a number of bankruptcies. Apparently, 530,000 people a year file for bankruptcy. Think of that number, 530,000. That would be the population of Ireland over a 10-year period would all file for bankruptcy. It's a lot of people. And of those, 62% of those bankruptcies are a result of medical bills. Now, in case you think it's because people don't have insurance, 78% of those people who declare bankruptcy for medical actually had medical insurance. But because of the way the system is ran, their insurance didn't cover all the medical issues that they had. And the consequence was still that they ended up having massive bills, which ultimately led to their bankruptcy. And the irony here is that apparently, because of the number of bankruptcies in this area, the US government, through the Senate and Congress, are trying to strengthen the laws against bankruptcy. In other words, they're making it harder to declare bankruptcy instead of dealing with the root cause of why people have such massive bills. So you can see there how if you're rich, it doesn't really affect you because you have the money and the resources to deal with setbacks. But if you're poor, a medical setback can effectively ruin your life. In chapter 18, verse 11, it says something similar. It says, a rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his own imagination. So there's another effect of the rich can often, because they can see themselves as invulnerable, they see their riches and their wealth as a way of protecting themselves from life. And while it does protect you in some things, it can be a little bit of an illusion because of things it cannot protect you from. But for the rich, it makes them feel invulnerable, and that could distance themselves from other people. In chapter 14, verse 20, it says this. This is contrasting for the poor. The poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. He who despises his neighbor sins, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor. So on this again, let's look at these two verses again. This is chapter 14, verses 20 and 21, and there's a contrast here. In the start it says, the poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. So because people are rich, people want to know them, people want to hang around with them, they want to be their friends, invite them to their homes because they're rich and they have resources. But the poor, even his neighbor doesn't want to know him because he's always the one maybe in need. But again, Proverbs gives a balance here. He says that's what happens in life, but what he warns you, just because your neighbor is poor, you should not despise them. He says, he who despises his neighbor sins, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor. So while recognizing that life can be tough for the poor, it's also encouraging others to be gracious to them and to help them and not to despise them. Going back to the rich, in chapter 17, verse 8, it says this, a bribe is a charm in the hands of its owner. Wherever he turns, he prospers. So here is somebody who is using their money to bribe and to get favors for themselves. And as far as they're concerned, it's like a charm. It works every time. In chapter 17, verse 23, it shows the consequence. It says, a wicked man receives a bribe from the bosom to pervert the way of justice. So unfortunately, when the rich bribe people to get what they want, the consequence can often be injustice and a lack of justice for the poor. Similarly, down in chapter 18, verse 16, it says this, a man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. So again, if you're rich and you can give gifts to people, that gives you access to other rich people or to important people. So you can use your wealth to get access to the powerful and the elite. And again, this, as a result, can have a way of making life very unfair because the rich can have many advantages which the poor can never have. In chapter 19, verses 6 to 7, it says this, many will seek the favor of a generous man, and every man is a friend to him who gives gifts. All the brothers of a poor man hate him. How much more do his friends abandon him? He pursues them with words, but they are gone. Again, it's showing you what can often happen in life is that everybody wants to be the friend of the generous man. Everybody wants to hang around with the rich person. But when there's a poor person, people hate them. They run away from them. They ignore them. They walk past them on the street. They ignore them if they meet them in life because they don't want basically to part with their money to help them. And again, Proverbs is very clear that telling us this is what life can be like. Again, it's not saying that it agrees with it, but it's just opening your eyes to the fact that this is the way life can be for the poor. In chapter 22, verse 7, it says this, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. And this is a very interesting verse because it's saying that when the people you borrow money off of, so if the poor borrow money off the rich, effectively they become their slave because all their earnings from then on will be used to pay back that loan. And in a sense, they become slaves of the rich. So the rich in that way, because they have power and money, they can rule over the lives of the poor. They can affect the lives of the poor. Again, Proverbs isn't saying that this is right or fair. It's just helping you to see this is what life is like. So when you look at the way the world's economy are structured, and you see that a very small percentage of people control all the wealth, and a lot of people in the world have very little. That is the way the world is. It's not saying it's right, but at least be honest and see that that's what it is. Now, can we do anything about it, or does God care about this? Again, if we look at chapter 17, verse 5, it says this, he who mocks the poor taunts his maker. He who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished. So here it's saying that if you are rich, or if you mock the calamity of the poor, you look down on them and you basically laugh at their calamity, their poverty, remember, they have a maker as well, God who created them, and he will not appreciate that. In chapter 22, verse 2, it says, the rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all. So remember that God has created both the rich and the poor, and you both ultimately are accountable to him. So remember, when you see the poor, remember they're also created in God's image, and you need to treat them accordingly. So at this point, you might ask the question, and it's worth asking. The question you could ask is, well, why is it this way? Is this what God intended? Did God always intend for some to be ultimately very rich and for others to be just getting by and for a lot of people to be very poor? Is that what God intended? Is this what's in the heart of God? And there's a verse in Proverbs, it's chapter 13, verse 23. It says this, Abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it is swept away by injustice. So here it's saying that there is food available for the poor in what is called the fallow ground, but it's taken away by injustice. Now, let's take a little bit of time and look at this so we understand what this is talking about. And we may understand and hear the heart of God when it comes to taking care of the poor. This was a reference back to Leviticus in Leviticus 25, chapter 25, verse 5. And this is the way when Israel took over its promised land, it basically divided out the land among all the people. And then obviously there'll be some people over time probably work their land better and make more money, and others may go poor for different reasons. But there was always like a fallback position to help the poor. So in Leviticus 25:5 it says this: "For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes in your unattended vine. The land is to have the year of rest." So the idea was that you did nothing to the land. You just let it sit there. So some crops would grow away on their own. Your vines will produce grapes on their own, but you don't tend them and you don't take the crops away from them. So what happens to those crops that will grow naturally in the field and in the vineyard? It says in verse 6, "Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your male and your female servants, and the hard workers and the temporary residents who live among you, as well as for the livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten." So the idea was that the food that grew by itself in that 7th year was for everybody. Anybody can have it. It's there to sustain you. And in Exodus 23:11, it makes it even more clear. In Exodus 23:11, it says this: "But during the 7th year, let the land go unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." So here in Exodus 23:11, it's very clear that the food which grows during this fallow year is for the poor. It is to give them subsistence. So it's not to be harvested by the rich or by the landowner, but the poor can come and basically harvest it. So every 7 years they get this effectively free food, so they can harvest it and store it and use that to replenish themselves and get them ready for the next 6 years. Now what's interesting is there's a verse in Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles 36:21, and this is the prophet Jeremiah, and he's talking about when Israel was sent away into captivity. So now they've left the land, and he says this: "The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the times of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah." So it's an unusual verse. So basically what it says is that Israel had been in the land for about 400 or 500 years. So every 7 years they should have left their land rest, not work the crops and leave them for the poor. And Jeremiah says that now that they're away in captivity as a nation for 70 years, the land is finally getting its Sabbath's rest. So it's more than likely that they never implemented this rule. They never allowed the land every 7 years to get its true rest, and never allowed the poor to avail of that food. And so God, as part of their punishment in the exile, lets the land finally rest. So God always intended to have a means of fallback for the poor. Another thing they had was they used to, when they would take a crop from the field, when they they take out the crop from the field, they wouldn't cut by the edges of the field, by the boundary. You left a couple of feet of grain, and that was for the poor to come in afterwards, and it was called glean. And they would take the crop from the edges, and they take any seeds that fell on the ground that wasn't gathered up in sheaves. So there was always a means of the poor having some form of food and subsistence if they had basically become poor. In chapter 19, verse 17, it says this: "One who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed." So here is clear in Proverbs that God intends for people to take care of the poor. So you have the means to do so. You take care of the poor, and God likes that. In chapter 11, verses 24 to 26, it says this: "There is one who scatters and yet increases all the more, and there is one who withholds what is justly due, and yet it results only in want. The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. He who withholds grain, the people will curse him, but blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. So it's this idea of generosity. So the one who scatters, who is generous to everyone, he will actually increase. His wealth will increase. But the one who withholds, who's not generous, his wealth will actually go away and he will be in want himself. He said, the generous man will be prospered, and he who waters will himself be watered. It's this principle that when you give to others, you will get back in return. And in verse 26, he says, he who withholds grain, the people will curse him, but blessing be on the head of him who sells it. So at a time of maybe poverty or a time of economic hardship, when people really need food, there are some people who will hold on to the grain until the price goes up and up and up, because what they're trying to do is they're just trying to maximize their profit, and they will only sell when the price is at its highest. But here the proverb says, the one who sells the grain, in other words, when you sell it at its proper price, people will bless you because you're doing what is right. In chapter 21, verse 13, it says similar. It says, he who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered. So if you close your ear when the poor are crying out, when you're in want, you could end up with nobody listens to you. So it's kind of the idea that you sow what you reap. In 22:16, it says, he who oppresses the poor to make more for himself, or who gives to the rich, will only come to poverty. So again, it's the idea that if you oppress the poor, if you simply make money on the backs of the poor in an unfair way, you will end up in poverty. And if you only use your money giving it to the rich, which is the idea of effectively bribing or using your money to sway the rich in your favor, you will ultimately come to poverty. Now, the opposite of that is in chapter 28, verse 27. It says, he who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. So again, it's encouraging you to give to the poor. That's the way you prosper. In chapter 22, verses 22 to 23, it says this, do not rob the poor man because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their case and take the life of those who rob them. And again, it's this idea that when he talks about don't crush them at the gate was where in those societies where all the legal affairs were done. So this is the idea that because you're rich, you take advantage of the poor and you basically sue them, or you lose your legal power to take what is rightly theirs. And it says that God will not be pleased with that, and he will take the life of those who do that. So again, you're encouraged, do not abuse the poor just because you have the power to do so. In 23:10 it says, do not move the ancient boundary or go into the fields of the fatherless. And again, it's the idea that in Israel, every family had a plot of land given to them at the start. And so they'd put up a boundary around it and ancient marker stones to say this land belongs to this family. But sometimes, let's say the parents died, then somebody else would take care of the land until the children grew old enough. But some people would abuse that privilege and they would basically disinherit the orphans or disinherit the widow if she was on her own. So again, Proverbs says, do not do that. Do not do things that disenfranchise other people, because God does not like that. In chapter 29, verse 7, it says, the righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. Again, let's listen to this again. The righteous is concerned with the rights of the poor. So righteous people, those who walk with God, understand about the poor and they care about them. Wicked people, those who don't follow God, they don't understand such concern. To them, they only take care of themselves. So again, we're encouraged in Proverbs that our role in life is to take care of the poor. That is strongly put across in Proverbs, because that's what God wants, to bring justice. So as we can see so far, Proverbs encourages us to, yes, work hard and work diligently in order to make a living and to do well. It encourages us not to cheat, not to do things that are illegal. It encourages us not to get arrogant because of riches, and encourages us to take care of the poor and not to be unjust to the poor. It also gives us a balance between riches and poverty, because the reality is most of us will never be rich. Let's be honest. Everybody can't be rich. It just doesn't work that way. So the chances are for most of us, if we work hard and we do what is right, we will have a reasonable quality of life. And again, Proverbs warns us about this. It tries to get us to have a balance here. In chapter 15, verses 16 and 17, it says this: "Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox served with hatred." So here it's basically saying you need to find that balance. So you are better off to have a little amount of money and have less turmoil in your life. And it's better to live off vegetables and have peace with it and love with it than to go, for example, and work for somebody where there's only hatred and conflict and hardship. So again, he's advising you in Proverbs again that a little of the right thing, when you've got love, where love is there and where the fear of God is, much better than being wealthy and hanging around with people that you probably don't really want to be with. In chapter 16, verse 8, it says this: "Better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice." Again, it's the same idea that you have to find this balance between wealth and everything else. So it says a little bit of money is better if righteousness accompanies it. So if you were working for a corporation or a company that does things right and they pay you a low wage, that's probably a good balance. Versus if you went to work for someone who paid you a huge income, but there was injustice. In other words, the way they run their business is unjust. It takes advantage of the poor, it cheats people. So again, it's this balance that yes, you need money, but you have to balance it against all the other things like justice and what is right. In chapter 16, verse 16, it says, "How much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen above silver." Now here's another perspective. Again, let's read this again. "How much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and get understanding is to be chosen above silver." So now when you start to put money into the context of the whole of life, Proverbs is saying silver and gold, yeah, they're fine, but here's things that are way more valuable than them. To get wisdom, to get understanding. These are really important things. So again, we could ask ourselves, if we look at our life and where we put our effort into, is our effort always in the pursuit of wealth and what it brings, or is it balanced between living a life and becoming wise and becoming understanding? Again, Proverbs would say we have to have that balance, and wisdom is always better. In chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, it also warns us of the fact that wealth in itself, even if you gain it, it's only temporary. So in chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, it says this: "Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings, like an eagle that flies towards the heavens." So here he uses this great analogy of wealth is like an eagle. One minute the eagle is sitting there alongside you, and then it just takes wings and flies away. So wealth, if you set your heart completely on it and you pursue it and you keep thinking about it, problem is one day you could lose it all. Your wealth could leave and be gone like an eagle that flies away, and all your effort is for nothing. There was a friend of mine who put this in more probably modern terms, and he used to put it this way. He said, "You know, money talks, but I wish it would say something to me other than goodbye." In chapter 30, verses 7 to 9, it says this. The author says this. He says, "Two things I ask of you. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I not be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God." Now let's look at this again here, what he's saying. This is a prayer to God. He's saying, I don't want deception and I don't want lies, so keep those from me. Neither give me poverty nor riches, because with each of them there is a pitfall. If he becomes too rich, he can eventually become full of himself and deny God and say, "Who is God? I don't need God, I'm rich." Or if he becomes too poor, he can become in such want that he will do something wrong and he will steal, and in stealing he'll profane the name of God. So I think this is a really good balance to have, to pray about this area in our lives. Pray that we will neither be rich nor be poor. We will just have enough and be content with that, and avoid the pitfalls of both. And if we go to the New Testament in Matthew, Jesus says something similar to that. He says in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21, he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So again, Jesus is saying, if you set your heart on wealth on this earth, it can be taken away. Thieves can break in and steal it, or rust can destroy it. It can go. But if you store up treasures in heaven, in the things that heaven values, they will always be there. So again, that takes you back to Proverbs. If wealth comes to you, great, but then use it to bless other people. Use the wealth that you have to bless and sustain other people, and that will build a treasure in heaven, because that's what God wants. So use wealth to bless people. Don't use people to make wealth. Thank you.